All right, well, welcome everyone to our webinar today on gentrification and displacement near rail transit stations. We're going to jump right in because we've got a lot of content to get to in just an hour here. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'll be moderating the webinar today. This is part of a monthly webinar series that we do at the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportations Program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And it's a consortium of 6 universities around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. We've got a mailing list, and we'd certainly invite you to sign up for that so you can get notifications about our upcoming webinars. We should be announcing our December webinar here pretty quickly. If you go to ncst.ucdavis.edu, you'll be able to sign up and get more information. So today's webinar will last an hour. We'll have a presentation from Marlon Boarnet from the University of Southern California, and then we'll invite our guest respondent, Karen Chappell from the University of California, Berkeley, to provide some commentary, and then we'll open it up to all of you for some question and answer. You'll see there's a Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar platform to type in your questions. If you kind of hover over the bottom of your screen, you should see that. We'll do our best to get to all of them. The slides will be made available on our website following the webinar, as well as the recording with closed captioning. We'll get that up on our website here in the next day or two. So feel free to refer back if you need to. With that, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Marlon Boarnet. Marlon's the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis, the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. And Marlon, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And thank you to your colleagues at NCST for setting up this webinar. So yes, I want to present the results, which are of what is still ongoing research on gentrification and displacement near Los Angeles rail transit stations. Several of my colleagues I have been working on this for some years now, and I want to give credit to Jean Berinsky, a PhD student here at USC, and Raphael Bostic, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Sheva Radyansky, Occidental College, and Alan Prohosky from the California Franchise Tax Board. And is my microphone working okay? Mike, can you confirm?
Yeah, we're hearing you loud and clear.
Good, good. Just wanted to be sure. Okay. All right. So moving forward, since we do have participants at the Federal Reserve Bank and the California Franchise Tax Board, I need to show you the disclaimers from both entities. They are right here. These slides will be available after the webinar, so you can look not only at the disclaimer statement, but at some of the information that we may not have time to take a look at. And I want to be sure to say thank you to our research funders on this effort, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, the Metrans Transportation Center, and the California Community Foundation, each of whom have provided important support to this work over the years. The plan for the webinar, I want to provide just a little bit of background on displacement and gentrification. I'll go over that quite briefly, talk a little bit about the LA rail transit system, and then present the research. And the research, I'll describe a unique opportunity that we have had to work with record level California income tax data, which allows us to track movements of households into and out of rail station areas by income level. And I'll present 2 results. One is, using those data, how has the income distribution near Los Angeles rail transit station areas changed over time? And that near would mean within a half mile of those stations. And then secondly, what can we learn about the pattern of movement of households into and out of rail station areas by income level over time? And in particular, do we see changes in the movement of either low income or high income households into or out of stations, coincident with when a station opens. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about some policy recommendations, although I did prepare more slides than we can probably fit in, so we will see how much we get through. Very briefly, I want to start with what is admittedly a one-dimensional definition of displacement and gentrification. When we title this, what we mean is that when we refer to displacement, we are referring to larger than otherwise expected moves out of rail station neighborhoods among low-income households. And conversely, we would, in our own research shorthand, call gentrification larger than otherwise expected moves into rail station neighborhoods among higher income households. That is much too one-dimensional. The literature is far richer, and I'm actually, for that reason, going to shift into phrasing moves out and moves in. And so this is really an examination of who moves out and who moves in, and how is that associated with station openings. The Los Angeles Metro is a massive investment. Currently over 90 stations, on its way very soon to over 100 stations. Those are all new since 1990. Research has shown that rail transit neighborhoods are at risk of gentrification and displacement and neighborhood change more generally. Rail areas are also a focus for a large amount of proposals for housing investment, and that's all the motivation for this work. Briefly, we have a stylized LA Metro map of the rail system with the intersection points of that network towards the middle of the right hand of your screen being downtown Los Angeles. And so again, as of 2013, there were 93 new rail stations, 13 stations under construction. I want to briefly describe what renter levels and median rents look like in station areas. What I'm showing you, and admittedly this graph looks a little busy, is the combination of, for station areas, the percent of households within a half mile who are renter. This is from census data, 2009 to 2013. And the blue dots show median gross rent. So looking at the yellow bars, which refer to the right-hand side of the axis, these are for red purple line stations, really one of the older segments in the Los Angeles network, and the subway, the heavy rail component. And in those stations, from Union Station out to, on the right-hand part of that horizontal axis, North Hollywood, what you see is that within a half-mile area from census stations, looking at the right-hand side of the axis, these are heavily renter neighborhoods. These are half-mile areas with from 80 to, in some cases, over 90% of the households are renters, very heavily renter. And so of course, if there were to be land value increase, renters would not capture that in their home value, not being property owners. And so certainly neighborhoods where we would bring a lot of a priori concern about displacement pressures. The blue dot is median gross rent from the census, 2009 to 2013. And the gray bar, which is towards the upper part of the graph, is the HUD fair market rent for 2013. And that blue dot is below the HUD fair market rent, FMR, for every station except for Universal City. So there's a little bit of a summary here that I can give you. The rail station neighborhoods along the red-purple line are very heavily renter, and as of 2013, were places with a large amount of rental housing that was relatively affordable, with median gross rents in every case except one below HUD fair market rent. So lots of renters, at least as of the time of this snapshot, which is now 6 years old, relatively affordable compared to HUD FMR. This is for the red-purple line. The next slide, I will show you the Expo line, phase one, very same pattern. Heavily renter, median gross rents below HUD fair market rent for the county. The slide after this is now the gold line that you were looking at. A similar pattern, heavily renter until towards the right-hand side, you get into Pasadena, where the the renter tenure levels drop. And again, fair market, median gross rents generally below HUD fair market rent until you get into the Pasadena area. So that's kind of the context of large portions of the LA rail system. This is a rail system that was sited in areas with neighborhoods that were very large proportions of renters, at times as high as 90%, and housing stock that, at least as of the time, was typically on average below HUD fair market rent. There are some hints, even in census data, that may be changing. What I am showing you here is a map with circles showing the half-mile areas around Los Angeles rail transit station areas. And the color of the circle corresponds to the gap between median gross rents in 2009 to 2013 and median gross rents in that same area from 2000 census data. So what I'm showing you is that these circles correspond to the amount of rent difference measured in approximately 2010 versus 2000. The red circles are places where the median gross rent over that time period had increased by from $580 to $930 per month. I want to caution you, that does not mean that rental units had increases in rents by that amount. The housing stock itself could have changed. You might have had an addition of luxury housing that might have pushed up the average. But on average, these are places that have seen changes in rents over a 10-year period of well above $500 per month. The orange circles are the next highest rental increases by this measure. And what you see is that red and orange cluster around downtown, Hollywood, some in Pasadena, places that anecdotally we have heard concerns about rent burden, about rent increases. So while you would characterize these station areas as being originally places with high proportions of renters and relatively affordable rental stock, there are some reasons to think that there is rent pressure in these neighborhoods, and that really motivates an examination of displacement. I want to go into that right now and present the results of our research. We've obtained a data set under a secure agreement with the California Franchise Tax Board for anyone who filed California income tax in Los Angeles County in any year between 1993 and 2013. And for each of those individual filers, persons or households, we have available to us data on all their state income tax filings in all years from 1993 to 2013. That's over 140 million observations, of which we will use about 5 million for the regression analysis that I'll present to you later. The data are anonymized, they're secure, they are analyzed on computers that are not connected to the internet. Since while the identities of the individuals are blinded to us, we want to be certain that there's no risk that anyone else could obtain the data without appropriate clearance. The data are matched to 9-digit zip codes for 49% of the sample. And 9-digit zip codes in the bulk of our study area are city blocks or city block faces. And then we use zip code maps to use that 9-digit zip code information to match these individuals to locations. So what we have for a 20-year period is a longitudinal data set where we can track individual households, their income level in each year, and their location of tax filing, which we believe is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, their location of residence. The income tax data, we believe, are a near population, very close to the population. Tax compliance is very high. Even at the lowest income levels, for purposes of obtaining the earned income tax credit, a large number of households who would actually not have a tax payment due file. And we do believe that even among undocumented citizens, that there are good filing rates. We're not able to obtain information on exact filing rates among undocumenteds, but we do have a lot of confidence that going down into the very lowest income levels, that we think this data is a very good data source. Nothing's perfect, but the advantage here that we see is that these data allow us to track households by income each year in a way that, to our knowledge, very few other data sources are able to do. We use the data to sort households into income bands based on area median income for each of the study years. We will sort households into income categories: below 30% of area median income, 30 to 50%, and 50 to 80% would be areas of our primary focus. Those are the lower income levels that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has used to correspond to various levels of housing affordability. And then we also have higher income ranges, including 100 to 200% and 200 to 300% of AMI. I want to first show you income distribution for rail station areas sorted by these area median income, or AMI, categories. In differing years, starting from 1994 on your left and going up to 2012 on your right, we show the distribution of households within half-mile areas of the rail station that are in different income groups. The orange is the fraction of the rail areas that households that are below 30% of AMI. This is for the blue line stations, and you can see that in 1994, 48% of the households living within a half mile were below 30% of AMI for that year. By 2012, that fraction had dropped to 37% below 30% of AMI. So a sizable reduction in that fraction of persons living within station areas who are in that very poorest category. And at the upper top of your bar chart, a corresponding increase in the fractions who in particular are in the 100 to 200% of AMI range, which is the green part of the bar chart. Notice the time pattern of this. The drop in those low-income households and the increase in share of the highest income households occurs from 1994 to 2003. And then onward, if anything, there's an increasing share from 2003 to 2012 in the share of the lowest income households. That's a pattern that occurs in other station areas also. This is for the stations on the blue line. Next, I'm going to show you stations on the gold line. And you see the same qualitative pattern, a drop in the share within the half-mile area of stations of the lowest income households, the orange bar, out to 2003, increases in the share of the highest income households, and in particular, look at the green bars. But the action is really occurring from 1994 to 2003. By the way, that is before gold line stations opened up. And then the red-purple line stations, including the subway, the same general time pattern, substantial drop in the share of the lowest income household within the half-mile areas, having occurred from 1994 to 2003. We also looked at these income distributions for LA County, and I do not have that graph available in this presentation, but I will tell you that what I just showed you for the station areas mirrors county-wide trends. So interestingly, at first glance, you would look at this and say, aha, we have a signal of gentrification. The low-income share near these station areas dropped and dropped substantially. But I want to mention two cautions. This appears to be mirroring what has happened in the county generally. And then secondly, the bulk of this occurred from 1994 to 2003. If anything, there was some small rebound in the share of low-income households from 2003 going to 2012 near station areas. And not all of the stations were open during that point in time. So if you wanted to attribute these changes to stations, there would be, quite a bit of debate as to the time phasing of that. This is kind of a precursor to look at movements in and out of station areas by income level. And I think when people think about displacement in particular, they're thinking about low-income households moving out of station areas at rates that might be otherwise higher than, say, some counterfactual. So we use our data to classify a move as cases where a move out would be a filer who filed within a half-mile station area by 9-digit zip code in 1 year, and then outside of that same station area in the following year. And similarly, we use the same kind of logic to define moves into station areas. And I will show you briefly information on moves out and moves in to station areas. Using these data, we can calculate over the 20-year time period of our data, approximately 20 years, 1994 to 2012. We can calculate average move-out rates from station areas for that entire time period, and average move-in rates into station areas for the entire time period by income level. So the lowest income group, below 30% of AMI, on average moved out at about 9.4% per year, leaving station areas. So, slightly less than 1 out of every 10 station area filers in a year will leave the station area. The move-in rates are similar, highest at the low income level, and usually just kind of a tick below the move-out rates into station areas. We conducted a regression analysis where we regressed the move-out and move-in rates on variables for the station, the year, and indicator variables for whether the station was open, really looking at whether or not the opening of a station had a statistically significant effect on either move-out or move-in rates. And I'll give you information about that right now. The short answer is that at many income levels, opening of a station was not associated with a change in either move-out or move-in rates. At some income levels, there was a statistically significant association, and I list those here. A station opening is associated with reduced in-movement of the below 30% of AMI, and reduced in-movement, interestingly, of the 100 to 200% of AMI. The station opening is associated with reduced out movement of the 30 to 50 and 50 to 80% of AMI. Now, reduced out movement would be the opposite of what you would expect if you were looking for displacement. Displacement would actually be more a signal of a station opening being associated with increased out movement. What we do have, though, that is consistent with a neighborhood change story is the reduced in-movement of the extremely poor coincident with station opening. So to the extent that these station areas may be associated with places where low-income persons have lower opportunities to live, our best evidence so far is that that may be more associated with reduced opportunities for the very poor to move into those stations rather than a reduced move-out rate. Still potentially neighborhood change, still potentially a reduced housing opportunity. But I do think we have to kind of be alert to how these markets may be working. And I really do want to flag the possibility that the station effect indeed may be associated with, at the lowest income level, reducing in-movement of low-income households at least as much, in our regressions, possibly more, than it's actually associated with pushing low-income persons out of the neighborhood. I want to give you some information from an alternative analytical approach, and there is a typographical error on here. My indication showed that I think some people are trying to ask questions, but I'm going to leave it to Mike to break in and moderate, because I actually can't quite see what's going on. So Mike, at any time, if you feel like you need to jump in, jump in.
I think we'll stay until the end. You're doing good.
All right. Okay. So what the top line on this means to say is that we are in the alternative analytical approach, combining 9-digit and 5-digit zip code data. The results that I just showed you were from 9-digit only, which means using about half of the data that we have. The combining 9 and 5-digit has the advantage of using the entirety of the data. The disadvantage that 5-digit zip codes are quite large, in some cases with boundaries that overlap substantially inside and outside of half-mile station areas. So we have to do more approximations in terms of determining location. And for that reason, some of the numbers, that basic baseline numbers that I will show you here will be different. When we use the 9 plus the 5-digit zip codes, our estimates of move rates are quite a bit higher, with baseline move out rates, fractions leaving station areas, in the neighborhood of 20% per year, in some cases even higher. Very high move rates. I do caution, though, that is using 5-digit zip code data, which does require some spatial approximations. We do the same kinds of regression analysis where we ask by income level, and now this is only for move out rates. We ask by income level, does the opening of a station, is that associated with increased move out rates? And what you're seeing here by rows are the coefficients for different income levels. When the cell is gray, for example, the blue line, the expo line, the gold line, the green line, there's no statistically significant coefficient. The blue line actually opened outside of our time period using these data. It opened early, so we actually were not able to run this specification on the blue line. The only significant coefficients that we have in this specification are for the red-purple line. And in those cases, the coefficients, for example, at the below 30% of AMI income level, when a station opens, households in that income level increase their move-out rate from station areas by 1.5 percentage points. And you see increases at the upper income levels also. Now, remember that in this specification, our baseline move-out rates were about 20 to sometimes 23, 24% per year. So that 1.5 percentage point increase is maybe 1/10 of the baseline move-out effect, maybe even a bit less. And I want you to remember that 1/10 of an effect, that 1/10 of baseline effect. We tried the same kind of regression looking at stations 5 years after opening. The main effect that we still find that is a signal of displacement is, again, the red-purple line. 5 years after opening, 50 to 80% of AMI, about a 0.9 percentage point increase in move-out rate. So the short answer is that combining both analytical methods, let me see, I think I should go to this one. Combining both analytical methods, what we're finding are move-out rates for households near rail stations that are in the range of slightly below 10% per year to, in some specifications, 20% per year. So depending on which of those numbers one would take, these are areas that look like they have high housing insecurity. The baseline move-out rates are large. The question of whether or not the opening of a station is associated with an increase in move-out rate, we get at best some hints. And when those hints come up, they're usually for the red, purple, and the gold line, two of the older lines, two lines that were passing through areas that are today areas with some concern about displacement. But the station effect that we estimate, which is often statistically insignificant, sometimes statistically significant, when it is statistically significant, the magnitude of that station opening effect is about 1/10 of the baseline move-out rate. And this is what I want to really emphasize. If you asked, does the Los Angeles rail system, did it cause displacement of low-income households from neighborhoods that are 1/2 mile around a station? Based on our analysis, I would say that the answer is, first of all, that the much bigger effect was the baseline move-out rate. I begun to tell people if Los Angeles had never built a rail system, it would still have a housing crisis. These are neighborhoods that had move-out rates that in some of our estimates were quite high, and the station effect, when it is significant, looks to be about 1/10 of that baseline effect. It's not nothing. The station isn't doing absolutely nothing, but the much bigger effect for policy seems to be the baseline underlying level of housing insecurity and housing price and affordability crises in the county. I think we would be making a mistake if we were to attribute the whole or even the largest part of displacement concerns in these neighborhoods to the rail system. In other words, based on our regression analyses, had the rail system not been built, these would be places that would still have affordability and affordability concerns and concerningly high move-out rates. On the other hand, we are not picking up absolutely nothing from the stations either. We were getting effects. They're about 1/10 of baseline effect when they're significant. So there is some reason to have heightened concern around stations. But that reason is not because the station is what is driving displacement. I believe based on these results that there's underlying displacement concerns. And if anything, the station may be exacerbating that by an amount that looks small relative to baseline. What does this mean in terms of policy? This slide is simple, but I want to emphasize it. I think everything that we've seen suggests that we have to do two things, and we have to do them aggressively, and we have to do them at the same time. We need to build more housing near stations, and we need to provide substantially more funding from housing affordability. And I really want to emphasize that it is an and, not an either or. That from what we've seen, that California is dramatically underbuilding housing. Everything we know about our housing markets suggests that if we attempted to build more housing as rapidly as possible, there'd be a large number of households who would still have income levels that would correlate with very high rent burdens, and they need much larger pools of affordability support than are currently available. Let me give you a snapshot of information of what our building trends have looked like in Los Angeles near rail station areas. We used the City of Los Angeles open data to total the change in dwelling units, essentially new construction minus housing units that were taken out of the stock due to demolition from 2013 through 2019. And citywide, that was a total change of 60,000 units, ballpark about 10,000 units per year, of which 24,000 of those units, about 40%, were near station areas. So if you ask, is Los Angeles building housing near station areas? The answer might be a little bit of good news. 40% of the housing that the city added in this approximately 7-year time period was near station areas. A little bit of bad news, this building rate is actually well below what the city would need to catch up with a building backlog that had occurred in decades prior. Now, that 40% near station areas, 75% of those 24,000 units were in 3 and only 3 clusters of station areas in downtown, Koreatown, and Hollywood. And I'm showing those right here, literally downtown, Koreatown, and Hollywood. And I want to go to the next slide to actually list those stations. That downtown cluster had an increase of 10,000 dwelling units, Koreatown about 4,000, Hollywood about 2,000. The rest of the system in total was about 6,000. These are approximately 10 stations out of the approximately 90. So we are essentially not really using the LA rail system as a location for housing development. We are using approximately about 10 to 12 total of the over 90 stations in the LA metro system as areas of reasonably robust housing construction, downtown, Koreatown, Hollywood. The rest of the system has not much going on. So I think on net, while this looks like a goodish news story, 40% of all of the city's new housing units are near stations, I think it's a little bit less optimistic than that first glance might show, because what that shows is new building in a handful of new station areas clustered in 3 locations, with the rest of the system not really being a location of new housing development. Largely, this suggests that Los Angeles is underusing its rail system as a location of new housing development. And on that possibly not optimistic note, let me wrap up and show you several of the NCST and Metrans reports, which you can go to for additional reading. And I want to wrap up and I think turn this back over to Mike, and I think he will go to Karen Chappell and Jean Berinsky for some comments.
Thanks, Marlon. That was a great presentation. Lots of great questions coming in already. Just FYI, Marlon, I'm muting you while Karen and myself are talking because we got some reports of a little bit of feedback. Before we take questions, we're gonna turn to our guest respondent. Karen Chappell is the chair of the City and Regional Planning Department at the University of California, Berkeley. She spent much of her career researching these very topics. So Karen, we'd like to invite you to provide a short response to these findings.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, and Marlon, thanks for the terrific presentation. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm a big fan of this work. I think it's very, very solid and a great contribution, and I'm so jealous that Marlon got to use the data that he did from the Franchise Tax Board. So for those who don't know me, I just wrote a book with Anastasia Lucatus-Federis on transit and displacement. And in the book, we asked, does investment in transit, particularly a new station, displace existing residents? And our conclusion was, it depends. So it's not that straightforward. And we wrote a whole book to say it depends. And so in the big picture, Marlon's work and Marlon's team's work is consistent with everything that we know about transit and displacement. If there is displacement associated with the construction of a new station and a new transit line, it's probably quite minor. Now, that said, that doesn't mean we shouldn't put anti-displacement policies in place. So if you have a heightened mobility rate of 1%, that's still a significant number of households that are going to need housing assistance. And so we always want to be putting some form of anti-displacement policies in place with the construction of a new station. We could preserve a few affordable buildings around transit, and that would save the small number of households that are going to experience displacement. So the other thing that is very consistent between Marlon's team's work and ours is the focus on the reduced ability to move in, so the exclusiveness of what's going on around in these transit station areas. And in our work, we find that this is probably the single biggest impact of public investment. Rather than pushing out, what's going on is that the investment's raising land values and it's making it harder for people to move in. And this is particularly true in the core of our region, and that's something that this work shows as well, with the focus on downtown LA. So in the very big picture, I agree with everything this study has shown. I want to put out some nitpicks so that you get your money's worth from me. So not that I'm getting paid. So one nitpick is about who's represented in this sample, and and the presentation and the report as well does a good job, or actually a really good job, of looking at households by income. And I particularly like the fact that they break down the under 80% AMI group into 0 to 30, 30, 30, 50, 50 to 80% AMI, so we can really get a sense of the low income households. But we don't really have a great sense of who are exactly the households that are missing from this sample, because they're not in the tax filer database. And the validation in the report that was done with census data shows that there's a significant number of folks that are missing here. So I'd like to understand who those are. The second nitpick I'd like to make is about the time frame. Now, again, there's a strength to this research, which it goes from the early 90s to 2013. So this long-term look is exactly the type of research we need to be doing. The challenge is that the data ends in 2013. Now, as economists and planners, we're happy with 2013. We say, wow, that's a fresh new data set. It's just 6 years old. But this is really not that relevant for the folks out there trying to make policy on the ground for Metro tomorrow, to have data that's 6 years old. So and I think if we looked at 2019 tax filer data, we might be seeing something else, because it's taken a long time for the patterns and changes to emerge around transit in Los Angeles. Another nitpick is the radius within which the team is looking at displacement. So they're looking at a half-mile radius, and if you and the moves that happen outside of that half-mile radius. I think we have some literature now showing that actually the radius of impact is larger generally, is 3/4 mile or 1 mile. So and this can be really true if you have freeways or major arterials and so forth, blocking off one side of then maybe the impacts are all on one side and a mile out. And anyways, it's hard to capture. It's almost like instead of having a radius, we should probably have a number of households, number of blocks that we look at, number of housing units that we look at the impact. And then it's the thing about this radius though that bothers me is that low-income households in particular, when they move, they're particularly reliant on their social networks to find a place, and particularly if they have a situation where they're displaced unexpectedly and have to find new housing on a short-term basis. So what do? They call up their mom, their cousin, their friend. That person is likely to be local. So actually the majority of displaced moves are not far away to another county. Most of them are very close by. So in this sample, you might be calling that a non-move because it's within your radius. But in reality, the displaced family has crowded in with grandma across the street. And then I just want to go back to one other set of critiques, which is about the micro context of these stations. Because in our work, the reason we said it depends, it's because our transit stations are incredibly varied, and the immediate context of those stations is incredibly varied. And so there are some contexts which may be more conducive to displacement, or both exclusionary and outright displacement. And then there are others that are less conducive. So here are some of the micro contextual factors, and I hope that the team controlled for some of these in their regressions. For instance, how many subsidized units were located around the stations? Of course, if there's a lot of subsidized units, that's going to slow out migration from the station area. What was the station environment like? That matters a lot in terms of whether there's gentrification pressure. Is the station in the middle of a freeway, or are there a lot of amenities nearby? We found that it matters even like how walkable it is around the station, how bikeable it is. Are there crosswalks? And that's really going to affect how people are attracted to move into the area. And then there's this whole question of the station opening, because it's a positive event, the station opening, yet there's a lot of negative externalities in terms of the construction, both before and even a little bit after. You can have construction impacts that are really affecting these micro contexts. So to wrap up, I would just say, if you're thinking about the results of this study as a policymaker, you would want to really take it with a big grain of salt. The effect of transit on displacement is indeed really small, and Marlon's absolutely right. We really need to just be thinking about building a lot more housing around transit. Given that, still, you're going to need to have your anti-displacement policies in place to protect existing residents. And each station context, you're going to have to look at individually, because some contexts are more vulnerable than others. So I'll wrap up there.
Great, thank you, Karen. Yeah, really appreciate your response. So we do have a number of questions coming in, but Marlon, I unmuted you. If you want to respond to anything that Karen just said, you should feel free to do that. Otherwise, we can move to questions.
Okay. Yeah, let me just add one point, and I agree with what Karen has said. These are great comments. I think one takeaway, displacement is not the only margin of disadvantage. And I want to caution, I don't want anybody, I do think what we are picking up in terms of displacement effects from stations are small effects. I don't want anybody to believe that that means that whatever is happening in terms of the livelihoods of these households may be small. If you look at the rent burden literature, these are households who often go through extreme various forms of disadvantage in terms of cutting back on consumption elsewhere, difficulty, even sometimes skipping meals to pay rent, all kinds of disadvantage that may be associated with staying in the exact same location. So I really agree with what Karen is saying. And one thing I'd say is, if you think that the rail system is the only thing causing the problem, that would be incorrect. But I would caution, this does not mean that these are households in need of a lot of support, and I want to kind of reinforce that.
Great. Well, let's take some questions. We're getting some really good questions coming in. So Marlon, Karen, and then we also have Jean Berinsky, a PhD candidate at the Price School of Public Policy at University of Southern California, also available to pitch in on answering these. So the first question is, Los Angeles doesn't have. Sorry?
If you don't mind, do you mind if I take 2 or 3 minutes to just offer a few comments, and that may actually answer some of the questions that people also have?
Oh, please do. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right. So I think, thank you Karen and Marlon for the amazing presentation. And Karen, thank you for the great comments. We'll definitely incorporate them into our research. So we've been as Marlon mentioned, we've been working on this project we're continuing to work and improve the project. And there are a couple of things that I'd like to mention. First, we actually extended the data to go up until about 2015. So we gained an additional 3 years of observations. And more or less, that doesn't really change the results that we're observing. Regarding Karen's note, where are these stations located? They're actually, I think, mostly located in the residential areas, pretty walkable areas. So that's one thing to note. And then Marlon emphasized, rightly so, the pretty high rate of residential mobility. In some estimates, some prior estimates, for example, some of them computed by Seva Rodnowski, where he used the nearby 5-digit zip codes along with 9-digit zip codes, the mobility rates we were getting were in the high 10s, perhaps even 20%. In our work more recently, the mobility rates are actually a bit lower. They're in the 6 to 8% range. But then the effects that we're finding are more or less similar, regardless what mobility rates we're finding. So the effects, as Marlon mentioned, are about 1/10 of the baseline mobility rates. The other thing to note is when we can actually deconstruct where households move, whether they move out of rail station areas or whether a household moves from one station to another. And when we do deconstruct that, we find that most of the mobility rates are comprised of households that either move out of rail station areas or households that move into rail station areas. So, for example, if the extremely poor households, namely those that earn 0 to 30% of AMI, have a baseline mobility of about 6.2% across all the years, then 3.4%, or about half of that baseline mobility, will be composed of households that move out of rail station areas. And the same thing holds true for households that move into rail station areas. And why does this matter? Mostly because in these studies, we're actually using the nominal income of households, so the incomes that we observe every single year for the households, to construct the income distributions and divide them into income categories. In our later analysis, we estimate households. Basically, we don't vary the income of households so that we are more able to observe what are the effects on the income distribution near rail transit when it's only due to households moving into rail stations and households moving out of rail station areas. What we actually find is something that's quite different. So I would like to emphasize first that the patterns that we observe in LA County more generally and the neighborhoods that are adjacent to rail station areas are actually more or less the exact same as the ones that we observe near rail transit. And that's similar to what Marlon was suggesting earlier too. The difference is that if we look at the rail station basins, once we take out basically factor out the effect of income change, what we actually see is that in 1994, near rail transit stations, 34% of households were considered to be extremely poor. In 2003, 30% of households were considered to be extremely poor, so it dipped in those years. But by 2013, by 2014, 38 to 39% of households were extremely poor. So over the 2 decades, we saw two things. There's an ebb and flow to the number of extremely poor households that reside near rail stations. So it's not a monotonic decrease. It flows. And the other thing is there has actually been an increase in the share of extremely poor households near rail transit. And that's true, again, not only true for rail transit, that's also true for the areas around them. And that's, those are actually the only comments that I've wanted to mention. So I guess we can get back to the questions.
Thanks, Gene.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first question we got, given that Los Angeles maybe doesn't have the same usage of transit as cities like San Francisco, New York City, Marlon, or others, would you expect to see a greater effect of the opening of a station in another city that maybe had a higher degree of transit ridership versus LA?
Yeah, and as I understand the question, kind of, I think the premise was that Los Angeles does not have a high transit ridership, so maybe station opening effects in LA are not that big of a deal compared to transit cities. 2 answers. Our study is in Los Angeles, So technically we know Los Angeles, and Karen's looked at the Bay Area, but I don't want to, I want to stick to LA. I think it really depends on the neighborhood. I want to come back to the point that Karen mentioned. You have to think about the specific neighborhood. I think it would be a mistake to assume that Los Angeles is not a rail city. In some of these neighborhoods, we've seen a lot of development oriented towards the rail within Los Angeles. And I think we have seen similar pressures in other cities. So I actually would argue, let's begin to get away from, hey, Chicago's a rail city, New York's a rail city, X is going to happen, whatever X is. These are neighborhood level effects, and we have to begin to thinking about what is happening in that neighborhood.
Great, thank you. Another question we got was whether when the stations that were included in your study, when they were built, did the city include any anti-displacement policies at that time that you're aware of?
You know what, so I don't know down to a granular level of each station area. I will tell you, when we pick up effects, they tend to be along the red-purple line, which is the oldest segment, which opened in the mid-90s, late 90s. To some extent, the way we talk about anti-displacement now was not the same in that time period, so I would not expect as much. I think the bigger issue, again, and I think some of this comes back to the points that Karen mentioned, what was the stock of available subsidized housing, affordable housing, potentially even rent-controlled housing, which would have existed in some of these neighborhoods. And we've begun to look at that. We don't quite know. So I think there may have been other housing policies that would have, in some sense, protected some areas more than others. I don't think that would have been purposefully associated with the rail system. And I think looking forward, we'd want to be much more thoughtful.
Okay, thanks. So we also got a question about time frame, and I think I've actually heard Karen say before that displacement is not an event; it's a process. And so the question is whether you would expect any of the patterns that you observed to change if you had looked over a longer time period.
These effects happen over a period of time. And again, the fact that when we pick up things, it's for the red-purple line, which opened in the late 90s, and the gold line, which opened the first segment in 2003. These are effects that indeed may take some time to show up. Other portions of the rail system are newer. So looking forward, if we were to be able to move 10 years in the future, we may find more. These things move over periods of decades. So I do want to caution, there are parts of LA's system that are quite new. And the fact that we are not picking up anything does not mean that nothing may occur in the future. If anything, one might intuitively expect that the effects would show up, 10, 15, 20 years after the initial opening of the system.
Okay. So next question is maybe a little outside the scope of this research, but since we have you and Karen on the phone, I think audience would appreciate your thoughts. So the question is, since land use authority lies within local jurisdictions and not LA Metro, what tools can cities use to increase affordable housing, transit-oriented development efforts in station areas?
And wait, did you want me to jump in on that one first?
Sure, and we'd probably love to hear from Karen too if she has thoughts.
Okay, now let's bounce that one to Karen first, since I've been talking for a little bit, and I'd be happy to follow up.
Sounds good. Karen, looks like you might be on mute.
You're right. Okay, so I think we don't use our tools at the local level enough. We don't have enough, for one thing. It's very hard to do much about affordable housing at the jurisdiction level, but still we could be using zoning in a more strategic way. We could be doing more zoning overlays. We could be doing, my pet peeve is we have inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing in many cities, but we're not using it. We're not using the funds very strategically. Like, why don't we use some of that money to preserve affordability in existing buildings rather than building new, very expensive units near transit? So thinking about density bonuses that go beyond what the state does, that add on to it effectively. And then, of course, there's always parking. Like, boy, we could make a lot of the new developments around transit a lot cheaper if we didn't require any parking, or unbundled it, So we could be more strategic that way.
Yeah, and let me echo the parking point. Probably eliminating parking requirements might be the single best way that we could reduce the cost of units. So I think in our metro areas in California, we should eliminate parking requirements for new development now. There's really not an argument for anything other than that, to kind of jump to one conclusion. Our tools are not up to the affordable housing challenge. We should use inclusionary zoning more than we currently do. That would need to be tailored to the exact location. A lot of affordable housing was done under redevelopment zones, which were essentially land value capture mechanisms. And redevelopment does not exist anymore. We basically lost one of our affordable housing tools. And I do think we're going to have to begin to think about that quite a bit more. These rail investments over time increase land value, and to kind of soundbite right now, we let that public investment increase land value, and that land value increase lands in the private sector. And I think we need to reconsider what the appropriate split would be of the return from that public investment, and maybe there should be, I think there should be some return of the land value increase into the public sector to support affordable housing. Raphael Bostic did an estimate a few years ago that nationally, about 1/3 of all households who are in need of affordable housing are not able to find a market rate affordable unit, nor are they able to obtain housing support from any government program. So our current mechanisms are not reaching 1/3 of the households in need. And so I want to underline, unless we start talking about large increases in funding available from affordability, we are not really addressing the need that's out there.
Great. Well, thanks you both for that answer. We do have more questions, but unfortunately, we're a few minutes over time already. So we'll see if we can follow up individually to answer a couple more of these in the next few days. But I do really want to thank Marlon and Karen and Jean for your insights. And thanks to everyone who joined us today for the webinar. Please keep an eye out for a follow-up email that will contain a quick survey. We'd love to get some feedback from you on today's presentation and potential topics we can cover moving forward in the future. And keep an eye out for announcements about next month's webinar, which should be coming out shortly as well. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.